an hour together. Let us instead have the jocular Colonel Mason and not the unbending one. And so one last time I shall attempt a greeting and bid you all good morning.
Good morning.
There we have it. Now, I appreciate your welcoming. And yet, as I have already admitted, I know that I do so here as a member of this new government. Here in this year of 1777, we are at a peculiar impasse. We declared ourselves independent, last year? Here we find ourselves in May of 1777, and I find myself concerned. For it were a year ago, in that building, perhaps one of the greatest things did happen. In May. And yet, I should fear for it. But we've been discussing the nature of man, already admitted myself may be contradictory within the same day. I think this is the nature of man, but if we look then to our cause here, it is one that so too begs the question. What is the purpose of this cause of independence? What is the soul behind it? Is it to enact greater change? Or is it to maintain the status quo? I put it to you, which do you think it is? Change or maintain? Yes, already I have evidence that I know in my heart to be true. It is contradictory. There are those who disagree. It is my belief that man is ever changing. After all, I put it to you, how many of you here feel that you are the same person you were when you woke up this morning? A great many hands, I'm certain, shall go up. But I should put this to you. How many of you feel that you were the same person you are today that you were a week ago? A month ago? A year ago? A year ago we had not yet declared ourselves independent. And yet we had long been at odds with our mother country. We had long been saying that we wished not for independency, but instead a restoration of our rights. A maintenance of our freedoms as we have always known, yes?
Yes.
After all, the man who stands before you now, author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights and Constitution, man standing forthwith for that idea of independency and newness, wrote to a friend some 7 years ago that you could not find 5 men of sense in all of America who would take independency if it were offered to them. I've changed my mind. And yet, we should note that even my own words, echoing that we wish a continued connection with our mother country, written some 3 years ago in those Fairfax results. And yet, here we see that man is ever changing. And yet there are those who would argue that this cause is to maintain, that it has not changed. That which I wrote 3 years ago maintains and remains true. That this, our cause of American independency, is one of a maintenance that we have always known. Thus we feel this contradiction. And I must say, I worry. This spring of 1777, I think, portrays our current circumstance as not the change that indeed I may have hoped for last year. Of course, I keep referring to that Declaration of Rights, our Constitution, the great events of May of 1776, and yet there are those of you who are quite unfamiliar with me, so too you may be unfamiliar with the events to which I refer. Do you know what happened? The 15th of May, there in that Capitol building, 1776. For those who know? Yes? Done? One? I would even challenge, madam, perhaps what you are thinking of is not what I am thinking of. Undoubtedly you raise your hand because you well know, upon the 15th of May, 1776, already at war for over a year and yet not yet independent. Why? Because men were afraid of change. On that day, men gathered there in the building, that building, to do something wonderful. I imagine what you are thinking of, madam, is that those men gathered, voted unanimously to send a representative north to that Congress of Philadelphia with recommendations to that respectable body to declare these united colonies free and independent states, result of all allegiance to and dependence upon the Crown and Parliament of Great Britain. Yes? Yes, a wonderful thing, don't you think?
Yes.
And yet, it were a great first. A great first Now, I look upon some of your faces. Doubt, sir. You must be a Carolinian for that look. I know well. It is not that Virginia were the first one to whisper the words of independency. No, we had long heard talk of independency. After all, even by that time, there were independent companies taking up arms, marching against the king's troops. They wished to declare themselves independent. There were counties so homogeneous in their decision, wishing to be separate, declaring themselves independent. We had even heard of colonies themselves wishing to declare themselves independent. At present, the only one that comes to mind is Rhode Island, and frankly, I've only ever seen her upon a map. I don't think she constitutes much more than a county anyways. No, what were different, madam, but it were a united independency that were called for, with a representative to be sent to Philadelphia that they may vote upon such a map. It had not yet been introduced. Ultimately, we would see that ride and that vote take place there in Philadelphia. But first, here in Virginia, we voted. And as we waited to see what those other men might do, after all, the people of Virginia could not declare the people of Pennsylvania free, New York, or the Carolinas. No, we must wait for such a decision coming from Philadelphia. But down here in Virginia, we had an opportunity. After all, if you do away with the old, what must you do?
Make new.
Create new. And this is why I said, madam, perhaps we are not thinking of exactly the self-same thing. For yes, that were a great thing that we sent a representative, but I think the far greater opportunity was that the men voted, create a declaration of rights, such a plan of government as to secure the rights of the people and promote the happiness and prosperity of society. A Bill of Rights and a Constitution. Something that would be created for this, our new government, our new Commonwealth. That fear of change that had been so felt for the last 10 years, we had an opportunity to say, fear not, this is what we wish to see in our future. If there will be change, this is what the change may look like. An opportunity to show our brothers and sisters of those other colonies what this cause might mean. Codified in law for the first time. We had long thought of those from other colonies to be from other countries, from us entirely. They were of a different history, a different occupation, a different religion, a different philosophy. How then, too, might we unite under a single American cause? And so here in Virginia, we had an opportunity to lead by way of example, to create a Bill of Rights and a Constitution to show what our future may be, to decide what would stay and what would go. I must admit, I was not there upon the 15th of May. A smart bit of gap detained me at home for a short while. Of course, had I been there, I would have voted to maintain the unanimous nature of it. But instead, I arrived 2 days later. I arrived here upon the city, and they appointed me to a committee. That committee charged with the preparation of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Now, before I go on and lose myself to too much high-minded rhetoric, which is so often the poison of politicians, I have a curiosity here. How many here have ever sat upon committee before? I hear the chuckles. You sympathize with me already. The young ones, have you ever worked within a group upon some project in your schooling? Yes. The young ones may then so sympathize. For those of you who have sat upon committee before or are familiar with our conventions, you'll be unsurprised to hear that this particular collection of men was, as is our custom, overcharged with useless members. Now, mind, please, I do not wish to cast dispersions upon the integrity of these men there gathered. I do not mean to say that individually they were useless, necessarily. I had not opportunity to meet all of them, and the law of numbers insists that wherever two politicians are gathered, one is obligated to be useless, yes? it were not the integrity of these men. There are a great many, some of the best minds and hearts of Virginia there gathered. It's not their integrity, but instead its sheer size, were its greatest sin. Now, I have already professed a personal preference for the happiness of independency, the blessings of a private station. It will surprise none here to know that I would have preferred for a small committee upon this number. On that consideration, yes, some 3 members. But I recognize we cannot cast out one monarch or another, and certainly I do not wish that monarch to be me. Thus is the necessity and frustration of committee. It is a compromise. Looking out amongst you, I recognize there are those of differing opinions. The gentleman here, seeming about as sociable as myself, might have insisted upon a similar number, some 5 men, yes? Maybe 10. You try my patience, sir, but I could have allowed it. No, we recognize that differing opinions, there are those who, yes, might have insisted upon it. Some 10 individuals, and I could have happily allowed it. And yet were 10 men upon that committee? No. Were it some 15 men upon that committee? Some 20 men upon that committee?
No.
Some 25 men upon that committee?
No.
Get on with it, yes? 36 men.
Oh.
A third of the convention in its entirety. Do you imagine much was accomplished?
No.
No, we lost ourselves to 1,000 clashing and jarring proposals, when what was needed was a few men of ability and integrity whose country's interests were first in their hearts. Men who might create a perpetual standard around which the people might rally. The cause of this, our new independent commonwealth, the soul behind it, and moreover the aspects that might prove a greater, a freer, new government in our future. As the lady demonstrated, I need not continue bury so deep. You're now well aware of it. I found myself retired, not from the committee, but at the end of the day, at my lodging house. There, in that solitude, I put pen to paper, attempting to give word, to give shape to those liberal sentiments, what we wished our future to be. For those of you who did not raise your hand as a familiarity with my name, I am thankful for it, but you may have read words that have been influenced by our Virginia Declaration of Rights. That all men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights, which they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity. Life and liberty, the means of acquiring, possessing property, pursuing happiness and safety. 2, that all power is vested in and consequently derived from people. Magistrates are their trustees and servants and at all times amenable to them. Their government is or ought to be instituted for the general good and safety of the people. Of the various modes and forms of government, that is best which is most capable of producing the greatest degree of happiness and most effectually secured against the dangers of maladministration. And that whenever any government is found to be contrary or inadequate to those means, a majority of the community has the indubitable, inalienable, and indefeasible right to reform, alter, or abolish it. Now, it will surprise no one here to know that I was not nearly so concise. It were not just those ephemeral amorphous ideas of what a government is or ought to be. Yes, so too, that inherent soul of what our future might be was declared, but so too we saw in this, our Virginia Declaration of Rights, a promise. A promise of reigns placed upon a government. Again, we would see change. We would see something new. For the first time ever, here we would abolish hereditary positions. I had written that the idea that a man is born a magistrate, a judge, or a legislature is unnatural and absurd. They didn't like that language. They altered it, but the spirit remained. So too, we saw a division of powers. No longer should the executive legislative, and judicative be answerable to one individual, but those powers of government ought be separate from one another. And now, not just reins placed upon the government, but perhaps most greatly, rights guaranteed to you, a people. Not just in the forms of jurisprudence, rights to face one's accuser, to not be subject to any excessive fines, bails, cruel or unusual punishments, yes, all still contained within there. But so too, the manners by which ones would remain free in mind, body, heart, and soul. A free press, and a free exercise of religion. Now, this is well and celebrated. Submitted there to the committee on the 27th of May, 1776. Published here, the people of Virginia to read, but it would travel north. Printed in Philadelphia, New York, south to the Carolinas. It would go to that committee where it would go from the original 12 articles to 18 articles before shrinking it again down to 16 articles, all through the magic of committee. But it would be ratified on the 12th of June, 1776. This was the great promise for change in our future. I say that I am uncertain here, for I return once again to the capital city. I have recently retired myself from a committee on the revision of laws. Mr. Witt of this city, formerly Mr. Pendleton, formerly my friend Thomas Ledwell Lee, and currently still Mr. Jefferson of Albemarle. I myself, being no lawyer and thankful for it, removed myself from the circumstances. But so too there has been a frustration for all of these revised laws that are being discussed. How many have been taken up? Men not wishing to see a great change. Fear of this alteration of these revision of laws. Instead, wishing to see a maintenance of that they have always known. I do not know exactly what the future is. I may hope for change. I may give power to you, the people, but we must remember that this government were conceived of by a people who both wished for change, but so too wished to protect that which they have always known. And the promise of this, our American cause, being one of change, and growth of liberty and freedom, I might hope for a maintenance. The status quo shall always be there. For we're in the hearts and minds of men who create. And ultimately, I suppose I'm thankful for once again looking to that second article. The power is returned to you, the people, to make such a decision. I may hope for it. I may have been the primary author, but it is long since been mine and instead yours. This future may be decided by some of us here, but moreover our posterity. For I do not know a parent, and even if you are not a parent, who does not wish to leave a better world for their children than they themselves have known. But I apologize. I came here intending a conversation, to speak honestly with you, to answer any question or queries that you may have. I have a reputation for harsh honesty. I am thankful for it. I may answer your question to the truest of abilities, and if I offend you in the process, it is only my hope then that I shall not be elected come next election season. To that end, friends, I ask merely a raising of the hand if you have any curiosities or questions. Such silence, I would have welcomed any of you upon my committee. Yes, I thank you.
Regarding the right of free speech and a free press that you speak of, what if you had a press that was consistently spreading information that was detrimental to the current government policies and perhaps maybe included some falsehoods?
A wonderful question put forward. Speaking, of course, specifically to that right article containing the free press, that it is the greatest bulwark of liberty and may be only restrained by despotic governments. But what happens if a press is false in what it prints? Clearly, you've picked up several gazettes here in the city since you arrived.
Yes, I have.
We know this will always be true. Newspapers and gazettes are, by their nature, often opinionated. They have a perspective. They wish to convince you of something, or they wish to verify what you think you already know. That is how they sell more. The press will always be deserving of our suspicion. We must never take the press at its face value. We must always question it and question it again. However, we must also recognize that the absence of a free press is a far greater danger to a people. Thus is why we promise a free press. But that does not guarantee that it is always correct or is always to be trusted. No, we must take into consideration, yes, it is a freedom afforded us, and yet we see the vitriol, the lies, the opinions printed in a gazette. But once again, their shortcomings can never outweigh their opportunity for knowledge, perspective, hope, that it may so too offer. It is a difficult question, sir, to be certain, with an answer easily stated than found in reality. But for that reason, I should always wish to see a free but flawed press than any alternative. Other curiosities or questions? I've demonstrated that I may answer a very short question with a very long answer. Bonus upon me. Thank you, sir. The gentleman asks after my relationship with Mr. Jefferson. I should say that I had no knowledge of the man or correspondence prior to our being appointed to the committee together back in the fall of 1776. I had known of him previously. We had served in the 4th Virginia Convention together. In fact, I may have known the man better. I was asked to attend that Congress of Philadelphia twice. I refused, having too recently lost my wife and feeling that I owed a duty to my poor little family of orphans to whom I must lay the part of father and mother, both not in my stead, but at the same time, Mr. Jefferson was chosen to be a representative there north in Philadelphia. I have since been told that our philosophies bear a rather similarity to one another. But as for that, if there is a friendship with the man, it has only just begun and lies in our future, not in our past. I saw another hand. Yes, madam.
I would like to know, what do you think the framers of our Constitution would think of today's government and today's leaders here in the United States?
Ooh.
The lady asks as to what a term you use, madam, framers. I would not use such a thing. Would have an opinion of, you say, the future, some 200 years, let us suppose? Madam, I have already shared my opinions of politicians in my own time. I do not imagine that I shall have a growing appreciation for them in my lifetime or beyond. That being said,
Yeah.
we must recognize that government is fickle. It is my belief that the government of my father has not been my government. Government will be ever changing. And therefore, though I may have opinions of those 200 years in the future, that does not make me correct in that consideration. As I have already demonstrated a new government necessary for my generation, I have wished a better government for my children. I speak in our Virginia Declaration of Rights very specifically, that all men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity. We have since seen a similarity of that document written there in Philadelphia. The Declaration of Independence bears some similarity to that document written here in Virginia. Now, I know not the authors of such a document here in wartime. One most likely would not wish to be known as an author of such an inflammatory document of that of our Declaration of Independence. But bearing some similarity to that of our Virginia Declaration of Rights, I am rather confident that a Virginian must have sat upon the committee for writing that. And now, I highlight that difference after all why. For my own consideration, posterity must be mentioned upon what those rights are and who they are guaranteed to, not just ourselves, but our future. And so in that way, for better or for worse, madam, I shall entrust the next generation with the hope that they may do better than I myself have done. And if you have not yet experienced that, then maybe so too you should hope that a future generation may be better suited than the ones we ourselves have known. Yes, madam. The lady asks after whether I'm concerned of my own life in these turbulent times. Has my daughter voiced her concern about my diet to you as well? Yes. No, not my own, not in the manner that some men. There are men serving upon the field of battle. There are those who count themselves soldiers, who previously only counted themselves as shopkeepers, as farmers. We have officers commanding there in the field, the likes of General Knox, who has learned much of his battlefield experience by the reading of books, more than the experience upon the field leading into this. No, I do not fear for my life. My home is along the Potomac River. We have had no threat of the British coming so very nearby to such things, and even if they were to arrive, who should they concern themselves? Half of you did not know who I was upon my arrival here. How should they? But I will say this, madam. It is my belief that this, our cause of American independence, is a just one and a deserving one. We cannot reconcile with our mother country. The father cannot be brought back to the orphan, husband to the widow. No, the Rubicon has been crossed. The idea of reconciliation with our mother country is impossible, and with that belief, I would give every last cent of my fortune, every last drop of my blood to commit to its cause. But that being said, I must also understand that I am not a military man, though I carry the title of colonel. It is a civic title in its entirety, not a military one, since the gout has bothered me since my late 20s. I am no good for marching, and unless the enemy is a pack of slow-moving deer, I have no talent with a musket. So in that way, madam, no, I fear for the men who offer their lives upon the field of battle far more than my own. I believe if I had perhaps time for one more, doesn't that always warrant the greatest degree of questions? I should attempt. Yes, madam. She heard that it was the last one, and so she asked the biggest question. For those of you who did not hear, I should not even restate her question. I shall put a question to you. When that Bill of Rights, as written by my hand, was submitted to the committee, beginning with the phrase that all men are born equally free and independent, what do you believe was their very first question?
Slavery. What about the slaves?
Slavery. More specifically, what if the slave should hear? A curious question to be asked. What if they should hear? Of course they should hear. They hear everything. They're in our homes. They're in our lives. We rely upon them for our happiness and well-being. Of course they are to hear. What did he truly mean? What if they should think it applied to them? Now, the lady asked as to my personal opinion upon the institution of slavery. And frankly, madam, we may speak upon that in greater detail, but the long and short of that is that I disagree with it. It is a cruel and unusual institution. Every gentleman here is born a petty tyrant, practicing acts of despotism and cruelty. We are habituated from our infancy to trample upon the rights of mankind. I have written as much, and yet I shall not explore that too far, for I am the chiefest hypocrite. I am one of those petty tyrants. When I wrote that you could not find 5 men of sense in all of America who would take independency if it were offered, I concluded saying, yes, of course, we owed an allegiance and duty to our mother country, but we never would suffer to be her slaves. And what have the merchants of London, the members of Parliament, since said? Oh, look at those Virginians, how hypocritical, how contradictory, decrying themselves slaves while they are the ones who hold chattel bondage. I should say to you, who better to know slavery than the master? We have seen here in Virginia what happens when by piecemeal man's rights are taken away. We have seen first and foremost what this does to the people and say what it does to those around them. And so, madam, I believe already tipped my hand as opposed to my personal opinion of the institution, but instead I should highlight what was done. I have been stating this first article as it was originally written, by my hand, that all men are born equally free and independent, have certain inherent natural rights. No, this has since been changed. Instead, it ultimately would be altered, for there are men who said, you cannot write that. That is not true. A small group of men, so conservative in their thought, they did not wish to see this idea of freedom liberally applied to all, and so instead they said, we cannot proceed. Instead, it was altered. Instead, it now reads that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which, when they enter a state of society, they cannot be deprived, divested, etc., etc. When they enter a state of society. Slaves are first and foremost what, by Virginia law? Property. Is property part of society?
No.
No, and so very simply, they recognize that property does not have access to life, liberty, and itself. This bench cannot sue for its freedom. A horse may not be charged with treason for riding an enemy officer across the field. This tree will not be charged with murder if it were to fall in on you. And thus, cleanly, they decided being property and the necessity of being part of society, which we have already admitted as such. Virginia could not declare the people of Pennsylvania free. Why? Because we are not part of their society. And they are not part of ours. This is a truth to be evident. So ultimately, madam, they made an alteration. Instead of beginning with a lie, a hopeful one, of philosophical truth, but a societal inaccuracy, altered instead to one that is far more reflective and true, but allows the people of Virginia to celebrate ourselves as the most free and independent, and yet not have to part ourselves with our property in whatever form it may take. So I ultimately put it to you, which is better? Which is worse? I know not. All I know is when the men had the opportunity to answer the question of the morality of this institution, instead of answering it, they found a way to move forward. And I suppose that's the other side of compromise. Friends, we have come to something of a conclusion of our time here together, but I did see more hands, and I'm more than happy to address more questions just at the top of here, perhaps on the other side of the street near Mr. Palmer's in the shade. If we are to ever meet again, friends, I'm your servant, and allow me to end upon this consideration. Happiness and prosperity are well within your reach, but to attain them, to preserve it, must always rely upon your own wisdom and virtue. We have given you the reins of your government. It is the people's now. It is yours to do what you will. And to that end, I will forever be your humble and obedient servant, Colonel G. Mason of Gunson Hall, Fairfax County.